Before we start, quick story. I was out at a customer conference and I took my girlfriend recently, and I was talking to some people from Akamai, and we were talking caching, CDNs, origins, lots of acronyms that you never heard of. And she kind of took me to one side and said, like, you realize you speak in a different language when you're with people from work, and it's this impenetrable kind of language that no one else has any clue what you're kind of talking about. So I want to kind of learn from that experience. I want to just ask everyone, who's heard of Akamai? Okay. Who uses Akamai? Cool. So we've got a few customers in the room. Who uses another CDN? Okay. And who has their own CDN? So a few people. So wow. So you guys putting your hands up for everything down here, right? So you got like, you just like can't make the decision. You just want a bit of everything.
No, we have a business-to-business customers. So we have multiple CDNs. And we have our own CDNs.
Cool.
Depending on what customers.
Makes sense. Okay. So a couple of things we want to talk about today. So we want to talk about the new connector that we've built, which helps simplify the process of using Varnish as your origin and then Akamai as your chosen CDN. But what we also want to do is just talk about how this can simplify things for mobile performance. Now, I know we've had a little bit of like people touching on this subject already. I'm not going to shed any breaking ground here. I'm telling you how important mobile is today. We want to just focus on how we can improve mobile performance, both with the CDN and then also how we can do that very easily by using the connector. So just to run through the three things we want to talk about, it's mobile performance as a whole in general. Then we want to talk about the actual connector and how we extend that to your operations team, and then we're going to do a demo with a small caveat that it's not going to be a real demo. Okay, so the connector for Varnish and the Akamai. So it's pretty straightforward. For those of you who use Akamai today, you probably know and you suffer the pain that you have your own BCL, your rules and your caching rules and your purging happens locally on your Varnish. And then if you want to do the same thing in Akamai, you either have to use our separate APIs or log onto our portal to do the same thing. Pretty annoying. So the connector is the idea is to kind of do away with a lot of that pain. We'll go through these in a bit more detail later on. The top right one, I'm sure you're really pleased this one's in there, and that's deferring your ESI processing. So we know how popular ESI is in this room, and I know you're all going to be going away wanting to sign up to Akamai, get your Varnish ESI up, and like you'll be playing with that tomorrow morning, right? Or not, as the case may be. But anyway, so ESI is there, but there's the kind of standard things around purging, cache rules, making sure you still get the benefit from your Akamai configs. And then also the ability for us to start passing you things down into your Varnish configurations that we are detecting at the edge. Because again, as a CDN, we see a lot of traffic. We are right next to those end users, and there's certain things we can do for you out there as well. So let's take a step back and think about why this is important. So quick question for everyone in this room. Who has a performance budget on the homepage of their website? Back up a bit. What the hell is a performance budget? Anyone?
Response times?
Yeah, it's like a target, right? So who gets paid every month? Everyone, hopefully? There's no one just wandered in off the street, homeless people? No, right. So we do this at home, right? We have a budget. We get paid, and then we budget that money. We know that we're going to spend a certain amount on our, TVs, going out, having dinner, spending on alcohol, whatever we choose to do with our money. But yet no one seemingly seems to do that with their website at work. You don't have a budget that says, I want my web page on average to load within 5 seconds from an empty cache for users and things like that. And so that's one thing that we really should start thinking about is what is a good experience on our websites. So here's the Akamai developer website, and it's loading on a mobile phone. So what is a good experience? Like, you guys all use the web. What do you think is a good experience when you're using the web? 1 second, 2 seconds, 5?
2.4 seconds.
Sorry, 2.4?
Yes.
Very specific. I like your attention to detail. It's good. So anything 2.5, and that's too slow for you, right?
Apparently it is 2.4 since last year. So
2.4 is about right. It's kind of about 2 seconds. So, and as we all know, there's many ways in which we arrive at this performance. And also, what do we mean by performance? Is it total load time? Is it the time it takes to sort of render and paint something? And here is the website loading and web page test, and you can see the different film strips. And actually, something in here, it doesn't actually load until about 7 seconds. There's nothing on screen for the user. So this is pretty slow. It's definitely not hitting your 2.4 target or our budget. And so what we like to do when we plot our user experiences is look at them as a histogram. Okay, we want to sample everyone. We want to understand exactly what everyone is seeing. And you normally see a curve that looks something like this when you start profiling your user experience. And there'll be a lot of users over on the kind of the 2 to 4 second mark, and then there's this kind of big slope down, sort of onwards, and then you see this big long tail of users as well. And you really need to think about, well, we've just had here 2 seconds. I mean, I personally think maybe something around sort of 5 seconds is acceptable in terms of total load time, with a rendering time much earlier. So you want to start looking at the percentage of users that you're actually getting in that cluster. Now, there have been lots of studies done that actually correlate performance to business metrics. So those of you who work in e-commerce will know that your business metric is all about getting someone to buy something, to convert. Those of you in media, like newspapers and things, your kind of key business metric is engagement. You want more page views per session because you'll get more ad revenue. Guys I was speaking with at lunchtime from the financial services side of things, like if you're talking about like signing up for a credit card or a mortgage, then the conversion is very simple. It's how many people actually follow that process all the way through. Now this is a study from Walmart done a few years ago now, where the correlation is clear. The blue bars is the page load time, and the red line is the conversion rate. And there is a correlation between the amount that something converts and how fast the page loads. So it's important that we make sure we understand how our business measures up to these kind of stats, so tying our performance back to our business metrics. Now, we did something similar with a UK newspaper where full disclosure here, we were trying to sell them a product that sped up the performance of their webpage. And they were doing their testing and any due diligence that you would expect them to do, and they wanted to check how much value did it actually offer them as a business. Now, it's all very well us going in and saying, well, we sped up your webpage, we made things faster. They wanted to check the value. And this is the line here of the before and after, okay? And you can see the blue line of the after, we managed to increase their pages per session, okay? So again, there's a definite correlation with more page views per session when the site is faster to load, and that tails off as the site gets slower. But you can see we did jump this up a certain percentage point by introducing this improvement in performance. So that was great. But what they then did was then tie that back to the business metrics, okay? So not just looking at us saying, well, we introduced this new product and your site got faster, great, we're heroes, buy it. We actually tied it back and said, well, we've managed to decrease your page load time by 2.5%, and that's increased the pages per session by about 3%. Okay, so as a newspaper, what does that mean? It means they have more people viewing more pages the faster their website gets, which results in more ad revenue for them. And when they did the calculation, it came out at about £50,000. So it was then a no-brainer for them to then go and buy a product from us that was obviously costing less than £50,000 a month, kind of paying for itself. Okay, so the first thing we need to do with performance is really kind of make sure we measure ourselves and see how we perform against not just the time element, hitting our budget of 2.4 seconds or whatever it might be for your business, but also seeing how that changes over time according to your business. I showed you a Walmart study earlier on. So this is a website called WPO Stats. If ever you need any kind of, what's the best word, incentive to kind of express to your business how important this is, this website has a bunch of case studies that are from all sorts of different organizations, and where they have tied in that business metric into their performance metrics. And then they've presented it back. They've been good enough to share the experience and basically shown the correlation between performance and improved business metrics. So again, WPOstats.com is the website. I saw a few of you writing it down. Take a look, have a look at some of the case studies on there. So you mentioned 2.4 seconds. Like I said, we always kind of say about 2 seconds is kind of the expectation of end users. There's lots of studies that have been done around the psychology of how a human being reacts to performance and things. And like I say, 2 seconds seems to be the kind of the average target. So if we look at this website, you can see there's a lot of users that aren't getting that 2 second experience. So what were they doing? How satisfied were they? Were they converting and things like that? And then finally we get out to the kind of people at 26 seconds, and you're like, who are those people? Would you wait 26 seconds for a website to load before you kind of abandon and go somewhere else? Probably not, right? And even again, like, so even on your mobile phones, I'm sure most of you will get the train home tonight, and your expectations will be exactly the same. That you still want that page to load in 2 seconds. You don't care that you're sat on a train, you might have poor connectivity and things like that. The blame will solely lie with the content owner and the website. Okay, so what can we do about it, especially on mobile, because it's challenging, right? Where do we start with improving the performance of our mobile websites? There are a number of different things you can look at, okay? Everything from the first object, the objects further down the page, the images, minimizing things, joining things together. There's so much advice out there, and actually knowing where to start can be quite complex sometimes. What we like to do is break them out into 3 main areas of areas you can improve, right? The first one is the network, and I can't remember, I think someone talked about this morning, is that, you know, sometimes the network's a little bit out of your control. There's not a lot you can do about it. But there are some things you can do to try and get around it. The device, like what can you do, what can you optimize for the device? And then thirdly, the content. So let's dig in a little bit to some of these. So let's start with the network. So UK, I think this was around 2014 when we first launched 4G. And it was great in the first year because no one was on 4G. And there was only a few people. There was only one provider. Vodafone, I think, were the first to roll out 4G. It was expensive, not many people on it, but the people that were on it were getting great performance. And then roll on a year when the prices came down, there was a lot more providers, then all of a sudden the performance wasn't as good. And you can actually see a decrease in the available bandwidth for mobile 4G in the UK. And again, it's something we need to be aware of, is that, you know, the bandwidth of mobile is a shared resource. The more people you have in a certain area, the slower it's going to be. So it's not something we can rely on to be consistent and always fast. So we need to think about that. So what can we do around the network to try and improve the performance for our end users? So these are kind of all things that we're kind of talking about here that are added value services for a CDN. So we've heard a lot about kind of building your own CDN, using multi-CDNs and things like that. And I think one of the things we want to kind of stress here is that there is a layer of kind of value-add features that a CDN can provide that are very easy to implement, and these are some of those features that can then have a knock-on effect to improving performance. So the first one then being IPv6. Again, lots of studies already done, but for mobile, using IPv6 is likely to give you an improved performance. So I think Facebook did a study. Now, I always very careful of my words when I say an improvement in performance with IPv6, because actually what you really are experiencing is a degradation in performance if you're only using IPv4. And the reason for that is because basically most phones are now using IPv6 addresses. When they then connect to the network, whether it be directly to your Varnish server or CDN, then if you don't support the IPv6 protocol, then essentially you're going to downgrade it, and then that has to go through some NAT hardware, and it's an extra hop. Okay, so just be careful in the way, whether it's an optimization or IPv6 is IPv4 is a degradation, but either way, using IPv6 would give a boost to your customers. Using TLS is something we can do, make sure that our websites are secure. Probably won't get necessarily an improved performance straight away just by using a secure website, but it does open up other things, such as HTTP2. I spoke to a few people around lunchtime. Just a quick question, anyone here using H2 today? Couple. Anyone thinking of kind of using it in the next 6 months or so in the process of testing? Yeah. The rest of you, never heard of it? Just not interested? Nothing, just a few nods. So H2, again, on mobile. So in networks where you have high latency, H2 is really good at providing a performance boost. Lots been written about the promise of like 30% improvements and things like that, and I'll be honest with you today, you are unlikely to see that across all situations. It depends on your website, obviously, but just be aware that, you know, certainly on mobile, H2 can play a part in improving performance.
It depends also how much you've optimized for HTTP 1.1. I mean, if you have everything right there, that will counter what you want to achieve for HTTP.
To be honest, if you've optimized well for H1, then
you still see a boost, but you won't see a 30% boost.
Yeah, the way I always look at it is if you ever run a testing web page test and look at the bandwidth consumption, if you're already kind of saturating the bandwidth, there's very little benefit you would then get from H2. Like header compressions would be one area, but apart from that, there's not really much else that you would get from it. Whereas if your bandwidth graph is very choppy and there's periods of low utilization, then that's where H2 would give you a bigger impact in terms of performance.
So it depends on the content?
It depends on the website, yeah. I think I saw a slide from someone the other day saying the best performance slide ever is one that just said, it depends. The best answer you can give to any performance question is, it depends. I was likening it to a politician's answer. It's like, I'm not going to commit. But, okay, so let's just think about some other things we can do around the network. So looking at round trip times as well. So looking at how long it takes someone to access your network and then making decisions on that. So we offer a service today where maybe we'll downgrade the quality of images if someone's in a really poor connection. But then there's other things you can do with it as well. So if you're working, again, I'm using the e-commerce space, but imagine you have a search page. Normally it brings back 50 results, but maybe you've detected that the network conditions are really poor for that user, so maybe you could trim that and only bring back 10 results, for example. And then finally, if you're talking about apps and things like that, then maybe looking at SDKs to kind of implement some of the solutions we just talked about there, so making decisions around round trip times and things like that. Okay. Let's look at the next one then, which is the devices. So in 2014, OpenSignal, again, data from them detected there were about 19,000 different Android devices in circulation. Fast forward just a year, and that's gone up to 24,000 different Android devices in circulation. Now, we're quite lucky. I'm guessing most people in this room have the latest iPhone, maybe the latest Android phone. Fair comment? We're all pretty technology rich in that sense. What about your parents? What have your parents got? Have they got your trade-off, like your old phone from last year that you looked to sell privately and thought, I can get more money from my mum and dad if I sell it to them for a little bit more money, etc. So, you know, your parents are maybe a device that's 2 or 3 years old. Any of you got children? What device do you then give them? Do they get the cast-offs that your parents don't use anymore? Or maybe you flip it around. Maybe your children get the first refusal and then it goes to your parents. So there's definite... Sorry?
And your grandparents.
Well, you know what? I used to have grandparents in here, and then someone told me off and went, not at my age, and I was like, well, all right. It was kind of a hypothetical kind of...
Nokia or Ericsson mobile.
Well, this is it. And so again, like, what are you providing on your website? And are that generation, is that a demographic that you're interested in? So, we should always remember that not everyone is as lucky as us to have the latest and greatest phones. There's going to be a lot of people who don't. So Jen Fitzpatrick from Google pointed out that 25% of new Android phones only have 512 megabytes of RAM. We've done some studies around image manipulation, and you could use about 250 megabytes of that just to store one image in memory while you're decoding it. And people tell me that phones are also used for like making phone calls and text messaging and things like that as well. So there's no guarantee that this 512 megabytes of RAM is just going to be used for loading web pages. So again, if you're ever testing your website, what do you do on a mobile phone? You pull out your own phone, probably. Whereas I would encourage you to go and buy some cheap Android phones and use those in your device labs for testing and see how those end users really see your website loading. So what else can we do on the device? So things that we've probably implemented, responsive web design, using responsive images. So using the picture and source set within your source code to load the right size image to the screen size that you're dealing with. Progressive web apps, not necessarily always going to give you something performance-wise. There is a focus on performance with progressive web apps, but it's more of a concept. Things like chroma subsampling our images, so reducing the color palette and the samples we take can help the device reduce the memory footprint of an image. And then maybe using browser-specific image formats as well. So we're going to cover images in the demo, so I'll hold off on a few questions on images. So what about content itself? So if we think about the content we serve on our web pages, this is the growth in 6 years. Nearly 4 times as big our web pages are in 2016. The back end of last year as they were in 2010. And most of these types of resource have grown at the same rate. So everything is growing. It's not just images. although people always talk about images because it makes up a large chunk of the page. But JavaScript has grown, CSS has grown. Has it grown because there's more functionality, or has it grown because it's just legacy old code that no one can be bothered to ever actually see what it does and they just leave it in there? So there's two questions there, but certainly, like I say, the trend is that pages grow, and also mobile is probably disproportionately big compared to desktop as well. So here is a typical desktop page at 1.6 meg and a mobile page at 1.5 meg, give or take a few bytes. When we think about the processing power of a mobile, the network challenges, you do not want to be serving something that big in comparison to what we're serving on desktop. So what else can we do with content? So no surprises here, caching. Obviously we've heard a lot about why caching is important to speed up content delivery. Using APIs, using ASI, I'm going to gloss over that one. Using client hints, so preloading, pre-connecting to resources, third-party resources, for example. Using things like perceptual quality, which is something we'll cover in the image side of things. And then also we've got to think about, okay, we've not really heard much today about security. We've kind of focused on performance, but how fast is your page when it's under load, either good load from busy sales or bad load from DDoS attacks and things like that. And bots. Surprisingly enough, I think on average, about 50% of traffic on all websites is not human traffic. So what do you do with that? Do you block it? Do you let it through? Does it then have an impact on your real users? So things to consider around the content that we're serving as well. So this is like obvious statement 101 for a Varnish conference. Caching is still important. As we say, no surprises here, okay? So I want to focus and dig in a little bit more on the caching side, because this is why we're all here. I'm sure you all have an appreciation that, even with all of these kind of technologies and features I've spoken about, caching is still probably the best way of improving performance of our websites. So this is a case study we had from from CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, where a colleague of mine went and had a look at their setup, and what they found is there were some real problems around their Akamai config and their Varnish config. And basically they just weren't aligned. So they had different TTLs in both. They weren't necessarily doing the same thing, so there wasn't great offload from the CDN layer and there wasn't great offload from the Varnish layer. And basically they just did a little bit of level setting where they actually sat down and went through content types, checked their VCL, and they said, okay, well, let's now just replicate that out onto the Akamai config, and you can see the difference in performance here. So this is some real user monitoring. Before the go live, they're kind of trending at about 3 seconds, and then they got that down to sort of maybe about 1.5 seconds after the go live, and you can see the benefits that this introduced. And it wasn't just in terms of performance. You can then go and have a look at the bandwidth, and you can see these big spikes on the left-hand side of that arrow. That was kind of what they were seeing before this work. And then after this work, you can see that it kind of levels off a little bit in terms of the origin traffic, getting all the way back. One interesting point here, I don't know if you can see it, was this little spike. And this was a news event that was like one of their biggest ever days that they'd ever seen at that point, and it didn't even get anywhere close to what they were seeing as like the average up until that point. So you can see there is a definite benefit in making sure that we keep our caches consistent between all our different caching layers. So we touched on it earlier, I'm going to recap it again. So what are the common challenges we have with a Varnish implementation and Akamai? Basically the duplication of logic. You have to maintain your VCL, and then you have to go and manage Akamai in its own portal or via API. There's decoupled changes, so if you make changes in one place, it doesn't automatically happen in the other. And then you don't always necessarily get the best out of your Akamai layer. So we talked about some of the value add services you can use a CDN for. All of a sudden, if you're not caching properly, then sometimes those features won't kick in, because we're just going to treat that as a dynamic request and send it through as normal rather than optimizing it. So why have Akamai and Varnish gone down the route of building the connector? Hopefully it's obvious. But firstly, it simplifies your daily operations. It gives you control around your caching configuration. You can then do it from VCL, which hopefully you're all familiar with. It's something you are using day in, day out. And then finally, any kind of application lifecycle changes, you can manage them at the origin without this horrible kind of add-on, bolt-on step at the end of your lifecycle management where you've got to log into Akamai, do that work again that you've already done locally and tested and things like that. So So hopefully it's kind of quite straightforward. And then finally, you've got your best practices around what you're using on the CDN as well. So I'm not going to go through this again. Any questions on any of these, just ask. But essentially, this is the 6 main features that you can use with your connector. Basically, this is the diagram. It's kind of got the extension from everything we've looked at today, where you've got your origin through to your origin varnish, and then Akamai then becomes an extension of that with your purging and your cache rules. This is the demo. That is not a live demo. I wasn't that brave. Fair play to Francesco, though, who has been very brave today with your demos. So first thing then is, if you want to use this, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone in the room, speak to your sales rep. This is in limited availability. You can go and register your interest from the Varnish website. It's free. So register interest, get signed up, and then basically install it, and then import the 2 libraries and include it in your VCL. Why would you use this? So this is an Akamai demo website we have for our image manager software. So I've got a commerce website here, and I've accidentally loaded a picture of me in a zebra costume, because that can happen. We've all been there, right? Instead of the right product image. And obviously that's gone out now to the Akamai config, and I don't really know what to do to get that off. So I'm going to go back to my CMS. I'm going to change that. I'm going to click on Purge now. I've got this request that goes out to my varnish layer, and now hopefully I can get my new image in. So obviously, like I say, this is kind of like a live demo, but not quite. So you can hopefully see the simplicity. So that's all great. That made my life easier. But what were we actually showing you there? What was the importance of those images? Well, this is why it's important if you're using a CDN as well on top of your thing, then you get certain features added on, and one of them could be image manipulation and optimization. Quick question. Who uses responsive images to serve the right size image to mobile devices? Few. Not many hands going up. Okay. Who changes the format of their images to newer formats such as WebP, JPEG XR, JPEG 2000, depending on the browser that a user is? No one. Okay. And who reduces the quality of their images? Maybe down to something like 90 or 80, something like that, to try and bring down the bytes of those images. Anyone? Quick question. Who uses Photoshop and uses Save for Web in Photoshop? No one? Okay. So when you save for web in Photoshop, it will generally put the quality down to 85. So does that mean everyone else is serving 100 pristine quality images, JPEGs on their website? Hands up who doesn't deal with images and doesn't really care. Okay, found the answer. Okay, fine. Cool. Okay, it's something worth looking at, because basically you can reduce quality of images, which reduces the quality, obviously, but it also saves a lot of bytes. Now, when you use a CDN, you could get the CDN to do all of this for you, and no coding involved, so you don't have to care, like you don't already. And basically, we'll take those images and we will change them into the right format for all those different browsers to get smaller images at the same quality. We'll also resize it based on the size of the device, and we can also use something called perceptual quality, where we actually use a structural similarity algorithm to look at the difference between the images as we reduce the quality. So once you go past a certain point where the human eye will detect that you've made a change, you stop and you don't decrease it anymore. So what most people tend to do with images and their quality is they'll just pick an arbitrary value, such as 85, because it provides a good balance. But what you find is with some images, you over-compress and they become a little bit grainy, and you see, like, especially images on a white background, you see that kind of artifact around the shadow. Or you don't compress enough, and actually you could have got better byte savings by going further. So this is the kind of thing that we look at. Again, one of the value adds of using a CDN, you can layer this kind of intelligence on top. So if you were using a VCL, we kind of looked at a little bit of code earlier. This is another disclaimer, not a VCL expert, but essentially we're looking here for some ESI, which I'm guessing none of you will ever do because you don't know, you don't use it. So the code at the bottom of this is basically just how you would set your TTLs and then sync those back out with the Akamai config as well. So pretty similar to hopefully what you're doing anyway. How many features? 6, good, we've got that message home. So what do we do? What's the action here? So basically, if you are interested, here's the URL. This is where you go and get the information on it, and I believe there's a form to fill in. It's in limited availability right now, but I think it's limited availability by name only, and the reason for that is because we want your feedback, not because there's any kind of worries about scalability and things like that. Available for Varnish Plus and Varnish Cache. It's free. For those of you who have worked with Akamai before, let me just repeat that. It's free. And then finally, if you do have a mistake with zebras, then this is definitely a way to sort that out. I think we're good on time. Anyone got any questions?
Is it available for production?
Yeah. Is it
ready for production?
Yes. Right. Yeah, so don't be put off by the limited availability status, was the point I was trying to make there. I think it's mainly limited availability by name only, and the reason for the limited availability is because we want your feedback. So by making you sign a form and telling you it's limited availability, it gives us an excuse to come and talk to you about it and ask you how you're getting on and what you might want to change about it and things.
Okay.
Any other questions? Awesome. Thank you very much.